We now move to pay and productivity and look at the wage determination within the firm. In previous discussions, we had illustrated managers having few choices to make about pay. And we were saying that they simply found the marginal revenue productivity of a worker and set the wage if it was not competitive. In reality, however, how productive somebody is not always predictable. There are some unknown factors. So it's not just you hire an additional worker, you get this much more output. It depends entirely on what type of worker you hire. So how productive a worker is going to depend on a few things. The first being work habits. Workers differ in their work habits and productivity. Now, from an employer standpoint, it's difficult and costly to observe this before hiring a worker. So there's an issue there. Motivation. Productivity can vary depending on how motivated a worker is. Productivity is also going to depend on factors like the ability of the worker, the effort they want to put forth, the environment they're in. And finally, initiative. People need to take the initiative if they want to progress in their career. So employers must choose management strategies and compensation policies to obtain the right kind of employees. And by the right kind of employees, those are going to be the employees that are going to make them the highest profits. If we look at the employment contract, an employment contract is between a principal and an agent. The employer is the principal. The employee is the agent. The employee is working for the employer. When it comes to employment contracts, there's two types of contracts. There are formal contracts, and these formal contracts explicitly lay out the promises by both parties and what happens if either party fails to hold up their end of the bargain. Once it's signed, it's binding. So, for example, with a formal contract, it would say, by taking this employment, you are to perform tasks X, Y, and Z, and if you do that, you will get $50,000 a year. If one party doesn't hold up to that, then the contract will be considered broken. A lot of contracts, however, looking at employment is implicit, however. And most employment contracts are implicit. Most tasks out there are not completely spelled out up front. And there's more of an informal understanding that's made. And in the United States, we have what is known as at-will employment. And that employment means that the employer can fire the worker at any time without great reason. Now, there are some exceptions to this, but in general, that sums it up. So what that does is it gives the employers a lot of latitude. So, for example, implicit means that the worker is going to work hard and they're going to work to get everything done on time and they're going to give their best effort. May not formally say that in the contract because you can't really measure that, but if the employer feels that they're not upholding their end there and they're not working their hardest, then they can fire them. Because of those contracts and because the employers don't fully know everything about the employee coming in, their motivation, their work habit, their dedication, there's a lot of information asymmetry. So information asymmetry is when one party knows more than another. In this case, the employee knows more about their work habits, about their work ethic, about their ability than the employer does. So what happens is that it's often advantageous for one or both parties to cheat on the agreement. Now this opportunity arises when there is this information asymmetry. So for example, an employer claiming they give you a raise but don't actually intend to do it. Or an employee saying that they will work their hardest when they don't intend to do it. So it's in both parties' interest to trust in the other one, but at the same time, in their own interest, in individual interest, to cheating is there are benefits to that from the individual standpoint. Now, how do you discourage cheating? So cheating is when you don't fully live up to the contract. The first way is by hiring the right kind of person. Okay. Hiring the worker that's going to give you the best productivity. Well, how do they know this? If the worker has not come in yet, how do they actually know that worker is going to be a good worker? Sure, they can guess, but they don't know. So what they can do is because employers can't do a full background check on everyone, look into everything they do, they have to look for what are known as signals. Signals are something that individuals do that tell somebody else something about them. So, for example, if you go into a job interview with an accounting firm and you're wearing jeans and a t-shirt, you are telling that firm, the interviewer, that either you don't care about getting the job or you're not taking it seriously. So by hiring you, that you wouldn't be a very good worker. Other examples of signals, and the ones that are used more often, are things like how much education you've had. And so it's generally assumed that the more education you have, the better person you would be to hire, the more capable you are. Now, it's not always the case, and so these signals are imperfect, but they give the employer a general idea. Grades are another example. The higher your GPA, it sends a signal to the potential employer, that you work hard. It may not be the case, but again, it's the best they can go on. Other examples of signals would be during interviews, you're asked certain questions, and how you respond to them gives information about you. And so with all of these, the goal is to try to extract information through them that gives a general idea of how good or bad of a worker you are. Another way to discourage cheating is by setting up a system for the self-enforcement. So basically, where if you are cheating, you'll be caught. This can be done a lot of times by putting incentives in place that will cause both parties to hold up their ends of the contract. Profit sharing, or paying for training, or paying based on your production, and all that. So all of these help to set up a system to where if you're not doing well, you as the worker are not going to be getting paid for it. It's in the best interest of both the employer and the employee to hold up their end of the bargain as long as the following condition is satisfied. So if we look at this figure here, this is the marginal revenue product at the current employer. And so let's look at the left side here. So this is how much an employee is worth to the employer. Down here, this is the wage offered by other employers. So if you were to leave the job, this would be the wage that you would command. As long as your wage is between there, it's worth it to both the employer and the employee to uphold that contract. And so the marginal revenue product, as long as that's greater than the wage, the firm is making a profit off of you. And as long as that wage is higher than what is offered by other employers, it's worth it to the employee, because by leaving, they would be losing. So the benefits, who would lose more, is going to depend on how close to these limits the actual wage is. With a lower paid one, the employer tends to have more at stake if the employee leaves because they're making a good profit off it, whereas the employee would have a lower drop in their pay. But if they pay them more, then the employee would have more to lose because they would see a bigger drop in pay. Now, this will hold as long as that wage is between these points. If the wage is above it, where the employer is paying more than the employee is making for them, then they'd be taking a loss, and they don't have the incentive to keep the worker then. If the wage is less than the wage offered by other employers, then it would be advantageous for the worker to leave and go somewhere else. So how do you motivate workers? Workers are utility maximizers. Now, this doesn't always entail working hard. So if you can do a job and get paid, but only put in 20% of effort and not get caught, for most people, that's what they're going to do. So what happens is that employers need to give employees the incentive to really work hard. There's two big ways to motivate workers. The first is by pay for performance. So paying workers for their output. It gives strong incentives for workers to be productive. This is very common when you talk about commission, or profit sharing, or giving bonuses if you hit a certain level. Now there's a problem with this. Overall, studies have shown that there is a weak link between output and effort. You could actually do a bad job, but are just doing it to get to that point. Now there's also aspects that are difficult to measure. And so, for example, friendliness if you're in customer service, or quality of care as opposed to quantity. And so because of that, it can be difficult to measure and pay for that. And that's the case in most jobs. The second type of incentive to work harder is time-based pay, but with supervision. So you pay someone for their time, but you keep an eye on them. And this is more common. So you have people oversee workers to make sure that they are working hard, that they are meeting their goals. The problem with this, however, is that it's costly. And so both of these systems, main systems, they have their benefits, but they're not perfect either. So it's really up to the employer to determine which route they want to go, or which route is best set up to fit with that type of job.